I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today's episode is a lecture given at the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference held in London, May of 2016. Presenting is Robert Ansell, discussing the androgyny of Osman Spare. Collected papers from this conference can be found as the Fenris Wolf Volume 9. The paperback edition is sold out, but the hardbound special edition that comes with a limited edition print that is signed by the artist of the cover art by Val Denham is available. I think there are about 4 left that we found at Trapart headquarters. So if you're interested, head over to www.trapart.net, that's TRAPART.net, and search for the Fenris Wolf Volume 9. A link to it is included in the text accompanying this episode. We also still have a couple of copies of the hardbound book of Rendering Unconscious, the book. That's Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, which came out in 2019. Those are on sale currently for only $12. So check that out at trapart.net. The other way you can support the podcast is by joining our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. Again, links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. You can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. As well, we have a special website for the conferences that address the intersections of psychoanalysis, the arts, and the occult. That's psychartcult. psychartcult.org. That's psychartcult.org. There you can read all about the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference series, the different guests we've had presenting, and topics.
Artist and art conservator living and working in New York. He has studied studio art in London and Italy and received a master's for conservation of works of art on paper in London. As an artist, his work attempts to expand the periphery of consciousness. He cites his fundamental influences as sequential art, the Italian Renaissance, and Surrealism. In the field of art conservation, Derek has always sought to work with visionary art or objects with sacred qualities. He has worked as a conservator or archivist at St. Paul's Cathedral, John Latham's Clocktown House, the 9/11 Memorial, and the Nicholas Roerich Museum. He is currently completing work for a solo exhibition, which he had right before this, and then he brought it here. So his work is this wall here, these 9 pieces called the Bastard Icons. They're amazing. I specifically wanted the Angel of Discontent because my analytic group is called Das Unbehagen, which is discontent. So I told him he had to bring the Angel of Discontent to my show, of course. So thank you, Derek.
Welcome. Thank you very much. So for this panel, our first presenter is Robert Ansell. Robert Ansell is a publisher, art dealer, curator, and scholar. His field of expertise is esoteric art in the 20th century with a specific focus on Osman Spare. Through his company, Fulgur Esoterica, he has represented esoteric artists in book form since 1992. In recent years, he has also gained note as an independent art curator specializing in the esoteric. Robert is also the publisher and art editor of Abraxas Journal, which has been described as today's preeminent voice for the serious study of occult and esoteric expression. He has been interviewed for the BBC Culture Show, the blog Boing Boing, and Dazed and Confused, and he also has a new Fulgur website, which is listed over there, folger.co.uk, and on you go. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by drawing upon something that Charlotte mentioned yesterday, actually, which was the tension that seems to exist if you are a practitioner between yourself and what Peter referred to as the monoculture. I actually think this is an incredibly important area that needs a fuller discussion. It probably needs a conference all its own, actually. What interests me about this is that why is it that we as a community seem to have this sort of existential crisis about this relationship with wider culture? I mean, there are plenty of minority groups who don't seem to wring their hands over this. I mean, they seem to exist quite happily, but for some reason we take it quite personally. For me, I think, considering this, it seems to stem for me around ideas of authenticity and validation and also intimacy. Because the reason why we're here, I think, is that we have questions that we need answered. And these are very personal questions. Sometimes these are questions which have been born of a personal experience. Sometimes it's a crisis in life that prompts us to challenge the way we're thinking about the world. I'd like to share with you the reason why I'm here. My very first memory, I was probably 2 years old, and I can remember lying in my cot, and I suddenly became aware that if I made a particular noise in my head, with a strange sort of metal jangling sound, that this strange turtle-like man would appear, and he would wander down the corridor of the house, and he would reach into the cot, and he would reach into my stomach, and I would begin a dialogue with him, and he would ask me what animal I'd like to be. And I could choose an animal. And at that point then I had this extraordinary sort of, almost an erotic sort of sensation that would sweep over me. And this is not the kind of thing you share with anyone, actually. I'm sharing it with you because you're friends. But actually, 45 years later, I shared this with my parents. We were talking about our first memories, and I said, "Oh, okay, hold on to your hats." And then my mother looked at me and she said, "Well, that answers the question. We always wondered who the hell you were talking to. We could hear you on the babycom." So, this notion of these personal experiences, the things that we have within us that we have difficulty sharing with the wider world because of the way we're judged, perhaps. It's difficult, perhaps, to be entirely ourselves. And I think that, when we're judged, it's like being rejected by a lover or by an angry parent. We have this kind of tension that's set up, and we want to resolve that tension. And there are many different ways of resolving that tension. I think the first instinct is to say, "You're wrong. I'm going to change you. I want you to behave differently towards me." Looking at the world around us, we want to modify it and make it more palatable for us and our experiences. And then maybe we realise that's actually quite a bit of work, and maybe we might approach it differently and maybe change ourselves and work on ourselves and make us, more compatible with the world. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the way an artist 100 years ago approached this problem. This artist, Osman Spare. This is a picture of him in his Winroad studio taken in the early 1950s by Bert Hardy. It's chaotic, as you can see. He was living in extremely reduced circumstances. He'd had a life of great hardship. He came here living with a friend of his from the very early days called Ada Payne. He was bombed in the war, lost his studio, lost everything. He ended up living in her basement, creating works of art, pastel mostly on paper. This is quite a well-known image of Spare, actually. And this is the Spare of Kenneth Grant. And for those of you who don't know, Kenneth Grant was fresh from meeting Crowley. He was an occultist, encountered Spare, and two men immediately bonded. They had a great sort of shared love of art. Kenneth more surrealism, which I wasn't so happy about, but in any case, a great love of art, and also a great sort of similarity of attitude to the world. Spare respected Grant, and on Spare's death, Grant inherited all of Spare's manuscripts and papers, as is amanuensis. He had the authority that goes with that. And 20 years later, Grant wrote an account of Spare, Images and Oracles of Ostens from Spare, and faced with the task of trying to explain how this man who produced a body of work, probably 2,500, 3,000 images through the course of his life, made absolutely no money whatsoever. How do you sort of present that in a way which makes it work, which makes it, sexy, if you like? Well, Grant framed Spare as a romantic anti-hero. This was the guy who lived in South London. He was sort of fucking barmaids and kind of doing a school of art. He was betting on the horses, and he lived in a studio above Woolworths on Woolworth Road. This extraordinary combination. Now, that reading of Spare has been enormously influential because it's mythic and it's heroic. I don't intend to, it's not my intent at all to dismiss that. Instead, rather, I'd like to add another layer to that. And I want to talk about a different man. This man. This is Spare 50 years earlier, age 17. His whole life is before him. In those days, he was living in Kennington with his parents. He had a small studio in the attic and used a beautiful way producing extraordinary works. But a very early work he produced was accepted and hung in the Royal Academy Summer Show in 1904. And almost overnight, Spare became a national celebrity, the youngest ever exhibitor at the Royal Academy. Not quite true, but that's what they were saying at the time. Suddenly, there were journalists camped at his door. He was besieged. As a very shy young boy, this was an overwhelming experience. He didn't really know how to cope with it. He certainly didn't want to be interviewed. And the press, in the way that they do when they're faced with a vacuum of information, started to make things up. Spare was going to be the greatest portraitist of his age. He was going to be president of the Royal Academy, etc., etc., etc. Spare wasn't interested in any of that. He was interested in this. This is a drawing from 1903. It's a strange biomorphic mass. What is it? It's partly dead, partly alive. It's a strange creature of sorts, nothing certainly recognisable. Fortunately for us, Spare has titled it, though you can't quite see in the top, Kia Sat. And what is that? Well, Kia was a term that Spare later used to define the absolute. I suppose the easiest way of considering it is in the lens of Taoism. Kia is Tao, if you like. It's certainly in its maternal, creative aspect. And Spare saw this expressed through living things, through the cycle of birth and death, etc., etc. This is the earliest expression of it. It certainly wasn't what the journalists wanted to see. They wanted him to be conventional. And he felt like he had to, if you like, issue some kind of manifesto. And he did. This book. Earth Inferno. Now, as you can imagine from the title, this draws quite heavily from Dante's Inferno. But for Spare, he sort of inverted it, if you like, because for him, the world he was living in was absolute hell. Why was it hell? Because it did not allow him to be the person he wanted to be. Here's a little portrait of himself in the book, and behind him there's a woman. Gosh, this is quite low, I hope I can read it. He says, strange images of myself did I create as I gazed into the seeming pit of others, losing myself in thoughtfulness of my unreal self as others saw me. Now, he's wearing here, I don't know if you can see, do you remember the little skull on that biomorphic creature? You can see he's got a little skull in his, what I call the Kia pajamas. Do you see that? But note also the way he's standing in front of this woman who has her back to us. It's very important. Here's another very important image. A creed of despair. My ambition is dead. I am exempt from my own creative pleasures, in barrenness of this world but remains. Yet in despair we begin to see the true light. Amen. Now I think this line is very, very important because it introduces the word amen. And he says, yet in despair we see the true light, and the illustration opposite is called the despair. Now, what we have here is a self-portrait of Spare. He's wearing an overcoat, he's turning profile to us, and then next to him it looks to be another self-portrait, but as a woman. Bear in mind, this is a 17-year-old boy in 1905 who is depicting himself as a woman in a published work. Let's go back to that line, yet in despair we begin to see true light. Amen. Well, Amen, of course, was an Egyptian god, was the hidden god. And he was the maker of things. And Spare was certainly very familiar with Egyptology, with Budge's works, certainly. And in the synopsis for Earth Inferno, which he handily gives us, we see this great sort of cycle. And in the centre is the Kia, and that's become now suddenly the head of a vulture. How it's evolved, it's become the head of a vulture. And of course, the consort of Amen in the Egyptian pantheon was Mut, who was seen sometimes as a vulture, as a mother, if you like. But what I want to draw your attention to here are these strange single-cell creatures, these amoeba, because they are, I think, going to be quite important. So the same year, 1905, Spare begins to develop this idea. This is a manuscript called The Focus of Life, the Papyrus of Amen AOS. Now you can see here this strange vulture-like creature again, which is rising out. We have this sorcerer who has it tethered. Some chance, I think. But, and this manuscript is full of the most extraordinary drawings of living things bursting forth. All kinds of creatures, strange hybrids. Sometimes you can see the line is actually so frenzied, he's not drawing anything specific at all. It's simply the exuberance of expression of life, if you like. Now, at the end, there is a self-portrait, and we can see this halo around him, and above it, it says the ascension of Amen AOS. And what's interesting here is we can see the Kia bird again, the vulture there rising up, and we can see him discarding this mask of conventionality. Now, a couple of years later, he produced the Book of Satires. The Book of Satires is a series of Hogarthian critiques of modern society. It's quite political. But there's one image in particular I wanted to just show you. This one. This is the artist, a more mature artist, if you like. And you can see him standing and staring intently at us. And behind him is this vast, very masculinized woman. And it's called the General Allegory. Beside them both are masks hanging down. Obviously, as an older individual, he has to integrate more society. He must have learned many different personas, many different ways of integrating. Now, this was published in 1907, and it was in 1907 that Spare had a show at the Bruton Gallery. And at the Bruton Gallery, he met someone called Alistair Crowley. Now, Crowley was quite taken by Spare. He was a young, good-looking man with a huge talent. Crowley liked that. So he said, you should join my new order, the Argenti Massacre. It's going to be great. So Spare signed up to that. And he signed up with this magical name, Jehovah. Now, I believe this to be a portmanteau of Jehovah and Om. Why? Because Blavatsky, with whom Spare was undoubtedly familiar, says the name Jehovah expresses a he and a she, and Om is the original of Amen. So this is a hidden he and she, if you like. Now, Spare didn't do too well in the Argenti Massacre. He never passed beyond the grade of probationer. Crowley was to later write in his probation form, an artist can't understand organisation or would have passed. But I believe the collaboration did have fruit. This book, The Book of Pleasure. Spare's relationship with Crowley was quite complicated because Crowley was very rigorous in the way he approached things. There was a sort of certain order, and Spare felt, I think, that he needed to express himself in a different way in order to show that he could do it. And the Book of Pleasure is the result of that. The Book of Pleasure is an extension of Spare's earlier ideas, articulated in a new way and broadened and developed. But one of the things which is distinctive about it is a series of extraordinary androgynous drawings. This one's called Emanations of the Ego. The Instance of Obsession. the self-sufficient woman. In the Book of Pleasure, Spare introduces us to some new ideas. Central to these is still the Kia, but he introduces something called the new sexuality. Now, he defines this as the ancestral sex principle. He says, time has not changed it, hence I call it new. He also introduces something called the neither, neither, I believe this is drawn from the neti, which he got from the Upanishad. Not this, not this. And I think the best way to consider this is a sense of negated self. And he also introduced something called self-love. Now, Phil Baker in his biography dismisses this as a sort of narcissism. I think that's quite a shallow reading, actually, as I hope to show you in a moment. But relevant to this particular conference is Spare's introduction to the subconsciousness. Now, Spare was, throughout his entire life, was extremely quick to draw upon new things and to draw them into his work and to incorporate it and to make it relevant. That's a very sorcerous attitude. You use what's available, you make it work for you. But he says something very interesting about the subconscious. Know the subconscious to be an epitome of all experience and wisdom, past incarnations as men, animals, vegetable life, etc., etc. The last is the almighty simplicity. He then also says, if we succeed in awakening them, we shall gain their properties and our accomplishment will correspond. Now, as this develops, you'll see where he's going with this. But the Book of Pleasure was not a success. He thought it might go to a second, third edition. He thought it would be launching him on the world stage, etc., etc. It was just simply too dense and complicated for most people. But also, the following year after its publication, it was published in 1913, the First World War started. And Spare discovered that his grotesque style was being trumped by the grotesque war that was happening. And suddenly that he was conscripted to the RAMC. He served very briefly as a war artist in a somewhat dishevelled way. The war was an enormously damaging experience for him. He lost his wife, the marriage dissolved. She sold his collection of books and tribal art while he was serving, and he emerges from the war with absolutely nothing, really. He ended up staying in a friend's apartment just near the British Museum. Now, you would think, emerging from this very difficult experience, where he's living in very reduced circumstances, the very first thing he would do is say, okay, I've got to get back on my feet, I've got to go back to employment, I've got to, No. He returns to the idea he had in 1905, the focus of life. And he writes to a friend, Frederick Carter, and he says, I want to do a book. Would you like to be involved? And Frederick Carter did get involved. He actually edited the book, and he produced what is probably the most professionally produced book of Spare's entire career. And the focus of life, it has this strange, dreamlike narrative, and it's full of these extraordinary, delicate pencil drawings. But it's a very difficult book to read, simply because it's so obscure. But quite recently, there was an extraordinarily... Well, it's very rare in my life, having been involved with Spare's work for 30 years, that the hair on the back of our neck stands on end. But when I saw this photo for the first time, that's exactly what happened. It's the sort of thing you see and you think, I never thought I would see anything like this. The folio of original preparatory drawings to the focus of life was discovered. And since the early 1930s, it had been, if you can believe it, in the collection of the novelist E.M. Forster. Now, it's my sentiment that Spare knew Forster and had sold it to him direct, because the folio contains things which could not be sold on an open market. This is the cover of the folio. And I just draw your attention to that round, circular being there for a moment. Here Spare says, AOS renouncing the past sexuality. It's a very clear statement of intent. You see, the focus of life, the mutterings, Aos. Now, I think Aos, a double A, AOS, is actually Amen AOS. And Spare has hidden the word Amen, so he's truncated it. Note again that strange round circular being, and this time in this vast, almost seems like a cosmic womb. Now, this preparatory folio is full of the most extraordinary, exquisite drawings, but there is one particular suite of drawings which I think is essential to understanding Spare's entire ontology. This I believe to be a self-portrait. Again, a self-portrait. This suite of 3 drawings, self-portrait, prior, just before, and after some event. Now, in the Focus of Life, there is one passage which is buried in the book, and in its verse says, "I assert the self-love to be a most secret ritual hidden by blasphemous ideographs, and he who calls, pronouncing the word fearlessly, the entire creation of the woman shall rush into him." Why? What is he seeking to do here? In the Book of Pleasure, there is a piece of text that says, "A microbe has the power to destroy the world, and certainly would if it took an interest in us. If you were to dismember its limb, the mutilated part would regrow, etc. So by evoking and becoming obsessed or illuminated by these existences, we gain their magical properties or the knowledge of their attainment." Now in that preparatory folio there is a drawing. AOS destroying the cosmos. And the actual frontispiece to the published book, The Focus of Life, is this. Now I believe here, to see Spare with the Logos, the book, over his genitals. He said to his great friend Frank Letchford that when he posed for this photograph and took a picture of himself, the flash was so intense it singed his genital hair. I think this is referencing Durham, actually, the resurrection of Christ. The drawing is called The New Dawn. And again, we see the woman behind him, we see this bell lifting, we see this great sort of menagerie of animal forms and life, etc., etc. And also there is an alchemical element to this too. So, in conclusion, what is Spare trying to do? I think what we're looking at here is a sort of an ontological ground zero. We're looking at a gender reboot. I think what he's hoping to do is by assimilating and becoming this androgynous being, he is taking himself closer and closer to the memory of the first self, the almighty simplicity. It is an extraordinary notion that everyone in this room shares one thing, is that there is an unbroken chain of life between us and the very first cell that existed on this earth. Spare was hoping that if he could trace those steps, to go back and to assimilate the properties of that single cell, that all its accomplishments, the entire life on earth, all the energy that's gone into informing that would be his to command. And I believe what he hoped to do was express that through his art, to make art that would change the world, would be creating a completely new culture. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a presentation by Robert Ansell on the androgyny of Osman Spare. For more, grab the collected papers from this conference in the Fenris Wolf, Volume 9, available from Trapart. That's TRAPART.net. You can also visit the conference website, psychartcult.org. That's psychartcult.org. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. For more of Robert Ansell's work, he runs the publishing company Fulgur. That's fulgur.co.uk. Visit Fulgur. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. From Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. For more information, you can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. Ourselves and based on you ever. Identity ego is first born during the child experiences with herself and the mirror. The mirror image appears. Sexuality is a force of nature that yourself be possessed by in New York City. Currently represented via our bodies, considered object. Geissenberg showed the cutting up of language creates the space for something slowly third being embodies countless numbers. Polymorphous perversity, transsexual, androgyny is divine. A being possessed, repossessed, as these sites are relaxation. We are simply sexual, repression, apparent. Vanessa Sinclair. Psychoanalysis, the pores of the skin. We learn about as these are the penetrated and expelled. Constricted to, nor constructed, and biology are limited. How anymore? Only contained. As self, every self. It is the object, dropped, not heterosexual, homosexual.
Sexuality is not in the realm by either the unconscious sexuality, third mind.